The Hermitage by Nancy Roberts. There are few people, alive or dead, who are more famous in South Carolina than lovely young Alice Flagg. She once lived at a house called the Hermitage in Murrells Inlet. The number of visitors to her grave is amazing, since it was more than a century ago that the 16-year-old Alice went to school in Charleston, studied, danced, fell passionately in love, and died a tragic death. Generations of young people have visited Alice's grave under the moss-draped oaks at All Saints Waccamaw Church. To this day, people say that the ghost of Alice still appears at the cemetery and roams the marshes of Murrells Inlet. Dr. Allard Bellin Flagg built the house in 1848, choosing a point of land surrounded on three sides by tidal marshes. He placed it within a grove of live oaks that at the time were at least 100 years old. They are still in the spot where the Hermitage once stood. A new development is being built here currently, although it was never a gone-with-the-wind style antebellum home. The first impression of the Hermitage was of a house with a character and serenity on a green lawn and surrounded by huge oaks. Across the front porch were immense white columns, each carved from a single tree. Riley Burns, a serious young engineer who visited the house from out of state, related his own experience. Often after my arrival in Myrtle Beach, the story of Alice would come up, and each time I would make a skeptical or sarcastic comment. Finally, I decided to investigate for myself and see if there was really an apparition of a girl named Alice. When I arrived at the Hermitage, the Wilcoxes welcomed me as cordially as if I had been an invited guest rather than someone who had arrived unannounced. Clark Wilcox and his wife Lillian were warmly hospitable and seemed to enjoy showing me around the house. The flooring of beautiful 20-foot lengths of heart pine and dowel trim, expertly done by slaves, decorates the front parlor. Upstairs over the front porch is an unusual, round, hinged window with curved spokes and a central eye. She probably looked out the window many times, for that was Alice's bedroom, said Clark Wilcox, gesturing toward the room on my right as I stood with my back to the round window. The room was white, as was the spread on the spool bed. Over a door hung a needlework sampler upon which had been worked in large letters the name Alice. It was a room that might have been typical of any young girl before the Civil War, what with its dainty, ruffled curtains, its innocence, its simplicity. We sat down on the porch and continued to talk about the house. The front steps and walk are of sturdy English ballast brick used to prevent light sailboats from capsizing in the mid-ocean. When not needed, these bricks were often thrown into harbors and rivers, and many of them, when retrieved, paved the streets of Charleston and Savannah. It appeared that Mr. Wilcox was not going to bring up the subject of Alice, which I had been prepared to ask questions about. Questions that, in the light of my host's obvious intelligence and culture, now seemed somewhat rude. Everyone who comes here probably asks you to tell them the story about Alice, I finally said, leading into the subject in a manner that I felt did not indicate either belief or unbelief. You're right, my host replied, and with so many questions about the story, I suppose that I have thought about her almost daily during the years we've lived in the house. No description of the Hermitage would really be complete without the tragedy of Alice Flagg. I gather you wish to hear it. I nodded, and Mr. Wilcox began his story. Alice was the 16-year-old sister of Dr. Allard Bellin Flagg, who built the Hermitage. Since there was a considerable age difference between Allard and his younger sister, and since their father was dead, Allard always dominated his sister. He was more like a parent than a brother, and at times a tyrannical and disapproving parent at that. On her last vacation at home from finishing school in Charleston, Alice wore her new engagement ring on a ribbon around her neck beneath her blouse, unable to brave Allard's rage if he saw it. She did everything possible to conceal her happiness, for she was aware of his contempt for a man who was in the turpentine industry, a mere merchant rather than a member of the professional or planter class. She returned to school after Christmas, and the spring was of a joy and secret planning for the future with her fiancé. The high point of the social season each year was the spring ball, which the debutantes were presented. Alice made her debut in the most beautiful white gown imaginable. Those who saw her commented on how lovely she looked and on the becoming color in her cheeks as she danced one dance after another with her fiancé. Her mother was not able to attend, for she had fled from the Low Country, with its dreaded malaria season, to the mountains. Fortunately, young Allard was not present either, too busy visiting patients and operating the farm. The day following the ball, Alice was suddenly stricken with the fever prevalent in the area. School authorities sent for Dr. Flagg. After equipping the family carriage with medications and articles for Alice's comfort, he set out with the servant over the miserable roads to Charleston. It was a 4-day, one-way trip from Murrells Inlet, and there were 5 rivers to ford. When they arrived back at the Hermitage, Dr. Flagg was able to give his young sister a more thorough examination, and in doing so he found the engagement ring. Allard snatched it from her neck with such force that the ribbon broke. Then he strode outdoors and threw it into the creek. Alice was broken-hearted, and when visitors would come to her sick room, she would beg them to find her ring. Her distress was apparent to all, and finally a young cousin went to Georgetown and bought a ring. When he pressed it into her hand, weak and near death as she was, she knew the difference. She threw it on the floor and begged him to find her ring. 1 week after her arrival home, Alice breathed her last. There was not sufficient time for her mother even to get back from the mountains before the casket was closed, and Alice was buried temporarily in the yard of the Hermitage. When her mother returned, the girl's body was moved to the family plot at All Saints Waccamaw Church on the river opposite Polly's Island. Beneath the beautiful trees from the old cemetery and amid the imposing stones raised in memory of the other flags may be seen a flat, white marble slab. Upon it is engraved the single word, Alice. It is an epitaph, telling in its simplicity. It would be given only to one who was unknown save for their first name, or so loved that the first name was all that was needed. I have walked through that cemetery many times and seen a vase of flowers on her grave, a tribute left to her by some unknown donor. People are very romantic, aren't they? Mr. Wilcox commented. Do you think that Alice really does come back? I asked him. People have been seeing the ghost of Alice Flagg for 100 years or more. They were seeing it when I was a boy, was his reply. When she appears, what does she do? Old people in the area say that she searches for her ring and that her spirit won't rest until she finds it. Does she ever come back here to the house? My wife and I have often felt her presence in her bedroom. An aunt of mine slept in the room while I was growing up. One day, when she was looking into the mirror and brushing her hair, she suddenly saw a lovely girl in a white dress reflected in the mirror beside her. She turned, and no one was there. Aunt Emma screamed all the way down the stairs, he said, chuckling. Then there were some who claimed to have conjured her ghost in the cemetery. Mr. Wilcox stared thoughtfully out over the salt marshes. Some nights I think she's out there, or even under the trees on the lawn, searching for the ring, never giving up her quest. I've looked for it myself, but I've never found it. I wouldn't know what to do with it. How could I get it back to her? Where is Alice's grave located in the cemetery? I asked. Beyond the church on the right. You're going to go down there, aren't you? I probably will. The sun had set by now, and it was getting chilly on the porch. We both stood up, and I thanked Mr. Wilcox for his kindness. It was time for dinner, and I looked forward to eating at Oliver's or one of the other seafood restaurants on Highway 17. I thought it would be best for me to go out to the cemetery in the morning. The meal was delicious, but as I ate, I became more and more tempted to find Alice's grave that night. If the moon was out, it might be possible. If not, there was no hope at all in the darkness. The sky was clouded over, and there was no sign of the moon or even a star. I drove south on Highway 17, and somehow, seemingly, without even being able to help it, my car turned right and took the road to All Saints Waccamaw Cemetery. I had a powerful flashlight in the trunk that I would shine on some of the stones, but trying to find her slab that night was risky. By the time I pulled up and stopped beside the old cemetery, I was beginning to feel foolish. If anyone passed and saw my light bobbing about out there, would they think I was a vandal? Perhaps a grave robber? Ahead were the gates. Would they be locked? They opened easily, I found. As I went in, I closed and latched them carefully. Where had Mr. Wilcox said her grave was? Somewhere beyond the church, past the front steps, and then to the right? Was that where he had meant? I shone my light on one of the stones, but it was not a member of the Flagg family. Off in the distance, a dog howled mournfully. Wasn't that considered an omen of death? I didn't know whether I was nervous or just felt foolish being there on such a mission. Sometimes I bumped onto markers that give me a real start. At other times I would step on a sunken grave and feel my feet sink further into the soft, sandy soil. For more than 30 minutes I must have wandered about the cemetery with no success. It's not easy to find a flat stone at night, and then I stepped on it. When I did, I jumped to one side, for the act of standing on someone's gravestone seemed sacrilegious. I shone the light down squarely on the white marble, and there, engraved in large letters, was the name Alice. My excitement was so great that I dropped the light, and as it hit the stone, it went out. It didn't really matter, though, because I had found her grave, and with my index finger I traced the letters. It was the stone I had been looking for. Someone had said that teenagers often come out here at night and walk around the grave 13 times, hoping to communicate with Alice's spirit. At least there was none of that foolishness going on tonight, for I seemed to be the only one in the cemetery. I had taken a picture of the Hermitage and wanted to take a picture of the stone, just as a curiosity, of course, but I could come back here in the morning before I left to do that. It was getting misty, and even a flash shot might not turn out well. "What are you doing down there on the ground?" asked a feminine voice. I turned around. Behind me stood a girl who must have come up without me hearing her. It was probably one of the teenagers who often visited the gravesite. I was looking for the grave of a girl named Alice. "Well, you found it," she replied. "Do you come here often?" "Oh, I'm out here quite a lot, most often when some of my friends are out at night, too." "Isn't it pretty foolish for you and your friends to come out here in this old cemetery to see the grave of a girl who's been dead more than 100 years? You make that sound like a very long time." "Well, isn't it?" "It doesn't seem that long to me at all." As she talked, I thought her dress appeared almost luminous. The moonlight must have been shining on it. I looked up at the sky, and the moon was out for the first time that evening. "Why did you come out here?" asked the girl. I suppose I wanted to know if all the stories I had heard were true and if there really was such a thing as the spirit of a beautiful girl named Alice. What a ridiculous question. My heart began to hammer. Do you mean you are Alice? Her white raiment was glowing even brighter until I could scarcely look at it. Of course I'm Alice, and my home is the Hermitage. Then what are you doing out here in this cemetery? I asked more boldly, but she ignored the question. Did you come to help me? That depends. What would you like for me to do? I want you to help me find my ring. I've been looking for it ever so long. I'm not sure I can do that. Your brother threw it away, you know. How could he do something so wicked? Where is it? While she talked, her dress became so bright that I had to turn my eyes away. A cloud of mist came rolling up from the river and enveloped us as we entered the cloud for the first time. I was afraid. If I ever see Allard Flagg, I will surely tell him, she was saying, and her voice then faded. When the cloud finally passed, the girl was gone, and so was the moon. I heard the angry rumble of thunder in the distance, the prelude to a coming storm. For the first time in my life, I found myself trembling violently. My eyes had been exposed to such brilliant light that they were not readjusting well, and the darkness of the cemetery was overwhelming. What had happened to the practical, down-to-earth engineer whom I had always considered myself to be? Without my flashlight, how would I find the gate? Suddenly I heard a metallic clang, and I realized that someone had closed the gate noisily. Was I imagining that I heard the rattle of a chain securing it? Had a night watchman locked me in? In my haste to get out, I stumbled over a footstone and barely managed to keep from falling. I stretched my arm out in front of me for some protection, and my fingers rested on a clammy marble face. Whether the face was of an angel or Christ, I was not sure, for I didn't leave my hand there long enough to find out. Finally, I managed to make my way to the gate. I reached for the latch automatically, and when I did, I discovered that I could have walked right through it. Instead of it being closed, the gate was ajar. What about the sound I had just heard? Hadn't I been careful to latch it behind me? Yes, I was certain I had. Riley Burns has become a believer, I thought to myself as I drove down Highway 17 north towards Myrtle Beach. That night I lay on my bed in my motel room, hands clasped behind my head. I thought for a long time of a girl named Alice, whom I would never see again, at least not on this earth. The Hermitage is on the National Register of Historic Places and located in the Murrells Inlet Historic District, US 17, Murrells Inlet, South Carolina. The end.